Trying to find the right words to adequately describe what God is like can be a difficult task. How do you fully describe a God as big and powerful as him? In Exodus 34, God uses these words to describe himself. Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness.
Well, hello. Welcome to Eagle Christian Church. My name is Jacob. I'm the Minister of Administration here at ECC. I'm not the normal guy that's up here speaking or teaching or preaching or whatever. That's normally Steve. And as you saw earlier in the service, he's over in Israel with a big group of people. If you've never done that trip, by the way, it's an incredible trip. It's you can learn and study and read everything, but to actually be in the places that the Bible talks about that Jesus walked is life-changing. So if you've never done it, you should definitely consider going on that trip. But if you are one of the ones left behind, like me, today we're going to keep going through the characteristics of God. And so we're on the fourth characteristic of God that we see out of the book of Exodus. We're talking about steadfast love and how God is a God who's abounding in steadfast love. That's how the ESV translates it. But before we dive into it, I want to ask you this question. Have you ever struggled to find the right word for something? You were maybe trying to explain an idea or a situation or something that was happening in your life, and you just couldn't quite find the right word, maybe because it just didn't exist. I know for me, I grew up in a family that my mom's side of her family, they immigrated from Holland. So my grandparents, I call them Oma and Opa, they grew up in Holland during World War II and then moved here afterwards. And so my grandmother, my Oma, I grew up with her having a very thick Dutch accent my entire life. And from time to time, she would say words in Dutch that I had no idea what they meant. So sometimes it would be under her breath, or if something went wrong in the kitchen, she'd be saying something in Dutch. And I remember as a kid, I was like, Mom, what does that word mean? And she'd be like, well, there's really no English translation. There's really no way to explain it to you. And I was like, it's so cool. Like there's this word that has no meaning in English. And then as I got older, I remember I asked my mom, I was like, okay, Mom, what does that mean? Like explain it to me. And it turns out she was just cussing, right? She was just swearing in Dutch and I wasn't allowed to know. But the situation is true. Maybe she just couldn't find the right word in English to express her feelings at the moment. We have those same things sometimes where there's just maybe not quite an adequate English word to explain what we're trying to say. We do this in our own language. You might not think of it this way, but we use the word déjà vu, right? We borrow that from the French language to explain this idea that it's a feeling that we've been somewhere before, that we've experienced something in maybe the exact same way before. It's this word déjà vu. There's no real English equivalent for it. I got a couple other words for you here. The first one is, I'm going to butcher all of these, is this word maybe Hygge or Hygge. It's a Danish word. It means a strong feeling of coziness, alone or with loved ones, where you feel utterly content, secure, and comforted, maybe around a fire. Maybe you feel that way when you're here at church, right? Anyone? Okay, maybe not. There's another word. Here's the second one. I'm going to really butcher this one. It's Verschlimmbessern, right? It's a German word, so maybe say it a little more angry than I did. It means to try and fix something only to make things worse. So you've all experienced that. You just keep digging a hole. It's like you're trying to dig yourself out of it and you just keep making it worse. It's what would happen if I kept trying to say this word. The next one, let me show you one more. This is a Welsh word. I think it's said haraeth, but it means a type of homesickness for a home that you can't return to or that never existed, a feeling of longing or nostalgia or yearning. And everybody got sad, right? Because you're like, I wish I could be a kid again. There's words, though, in other languages that we just don't have a good word to adequately express that idea in the English language. And I give you those examples to tell you that the word we're looking at today, that the ESV translates as steadfast love, is one of those words. It's one of those words that there's just no real one-to-one comparison to explain what that word is. And so what we're going to do for most of today is we're going to look at that word and try to unpack what that word really means, what that characteristic of God is. And so to do that, I want to just start by reading Exodus 34, verse 6 again for you. It says, the Lord passed before him. The Lord passed before Moses. He's up on the mountain and proclaimed, the Lord, or Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Abounding in steadfast love. So I want to start out by asking this question. What is Hesed? Hesed is the Hebrew word for steadfast love. That's how it gets translated in the ESV. And it's not pronounced Hesed. I'm going to say it that way because I'm an American and we don't know how to say things very well. Really, how it's pronounced is Hesed. In Hebrew, it's kind of guttural and deep. It's like you're clearing your throat. It's Hesed. And the enunciation is on the first part of that word, not the second one. Typically in Hebrew, it's on the second part. But this is Hesed. So sometimes you'll hear people say Hesed, or you'll hear people say Hesed, or Kesed, or Chesed, because sometimes it's written Chesed. It's really Hesed. And so just for fun, I want you all to say it with me, okay? So you got to clear your throat a little bit, get some of those seasonal allergies worked out, and say it with me, Hesed. Wow, you guys are pros. Say it one more time, Hesed. Good. It's that kind of deep guttural sound, Hesed. And like I said, it's undefinable. There's no direct definition for it as an English word. There's just no way to directly translate that word. And so you'll see sometimes in English translations where you'll see a word that's translated in a number of different ways. And anytime that happens, it's a good signal to you that something interesting is happening with that word. And so I want to look for just a moment at some of the ways that this word is often translated. So we say to steadfast love, Hesed. Wycliffe and Tyndale, some of the earliest English translations, they actually translated this word as mercy. Most of these words in Exodus 34, verse 6, are translated mercy at some point. They translated mercy, the King James Version and NASB, they can't find a good enough word, so they mash two words together and say loving kindness, or sometimes mercy, depending on the situation. The NRSV and the ESV, like I said, they translate it steadfast love. The NIV translates it love or unfailing love. I added the King Jacob version, the real KJV. I think a good translation for this, I borrowed this from an organization called the Bible Project. A good translation, I think, is loyal love. But you also could, I really think if you're going to do it total justice, you'd mash together a bunch of words and maybe say steadfast loving kindness, all in one word. Steadfast loving kindness. That is what Hesed really means. It's a very difficult word to understand and translate. So let me just try my best to give you a definition here of what I think this word kind of envelops and what it means. It's the kind of love that someone demonstrates, which means it's an active word. It's an active kind of love. So it's kind of love that someone demonstrates when they are keeping a promise and when their desire to be loyal to their promise motivates them to go above and beyond more than you would expect. So it's not just love, and it's not necessarily just steadfast love. It actually involves a lot of different elements. It involves elements of generosity and of commitment and really covenant. We don't have a great grasp on what covenant means necessarily in America and in Western culture, but it involves generosity, covenant loyalty, commitment, and all wrapped together in affection. It's a pretty broad word, and so you can see why it's difficult to translate that word. So I'm just going to say today a lot, Hesed, because I don't want to try to give it an English word. God is a God of Hesed. The best way I've come to understand this is maybe through a word picture or kind of an example. So if you imagine with me for a moment, an older couple, maybe somebody who's been married for 50 or 60 years. And at the end of their marriage, the wife is on her deathbed. So she's got some kind of terminal illness. And so the husband, he decides to become her full-time caretaker. He quits going golfing, he quits doing all his stuff, and he dedicates himself to take care of his wife and be her caretaker. Hesed. It's generosity. He's acting in a generous way. He's doing it because of his covenant with her, because of this bond that they have through marriage. He's promised for better or for worse, for richer, for poor, sickness and in health to take care of her. And it's all wrapped together in affection because he has love for her. Now, if he just sat on the couch and he said, I love you, I hope you get better, good luck, that's not Hesed. He might really feel love towards her, but it's not being driven by generous action. It's not Hesed. On the other hand, if he hires a nurse to come in, the act of hiring the nurse to come and care for his wife, that may be an act of Hesed. But for the nurse, it's not Hesed. Because for her, she or him, he might be bound by his covenant, by his job to take care of this patient. He might even do it in generous ways, but it's missing that affection piece. So it may become that as they grow in relationship and as they get to know the patient, but it's not Hesed. Hesed is something that is generous and bound by covenant loyalty and affection. And it's, I think, the most important word in the Old Testament. It's probably the most important characteristic of God, and it shows up all over the Old Testament. So I have a list here for you. It shows up 127 times in the Psalms, 46 times in Genesis through 2 Kings, 26 times in the prophets, and 13 times in the wisdom literature. It is a very significant and important word. And it shows up in places that you might not even realize. You might see it translated in different ways, depending on what your translation is, but oftentimes it's Hesed. So I want to show you two examples. Psalm 36 says this. You might know this song. It's a song. It's a popular psalm. But it says, your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Faithfulness is next week's characteristic of God. They're almost always tied together. Hesed and faithfulness are very closely linked. Your righteousness like the mountains of God, your judgments are like the great deep, and man and beast you save. So you might know that song, your love, O Lord. Yeah, anyone? Am I dating myself? Third day? Okay. Anyway, it's Hesed. It's not just love, it's Hesed, it's covenant commitment and affection and generosity all wrapped into one. What I love about this is it talks about the different characteristics of God, and what it suggests is that the characteristics of God and who he is what upholds the entire cosmos. The entire universe is held together by God's character. His Hesed goes to the heavens, and then it talks about how his judgments, his justice are like the great deep. They go all the way down. Another passage that you might know is Micah 6:8. This is also a song, if you grew up going to camps, you might know this from sitting around the campfire. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness, Hesed, and to walk humbly with your God. If you know that song, usually in the song it's said, and to love mercy. So it's just translated in different ways, but at the end of the day, we are commanded to love Hesed. That word love there is the Hebrew word for love. It's ahava. And he's telling us you should love Hesed. And so I want to just pause for a moment and do a quick little rabbit trail. But what kind of love do we prefer in our society often? We often look for a kind of love that looks nothing like Hesed. We desire a love that says, what can you do for me? What's in it for me? What have you done for me lately? And I will love you, and I want the kind of love that makes me feel something. That is not what Hesed is. It's actually the complete opposite. Because Hesed is not at all about what you get. It's about what the giver provides. It's not about the person who receives Hesed. It's about the person who is giving it, and it's born entirely out of their character. And so for God to say, I am a God of Hesed, means that he's not looking for anything in return necessarily. He's saying that he is a God who is willing to give up whatever he can for the good of the relationship between you and him. That's pretty powerful. And it's very different than love that we would typically define today. To really understand it, though, I think it's important to just go through the Bible, and I want to talk for a moment about some examples of human Hesed. Some examples of when humans show Hesed to one another. I think it will help us shine some light on what Hesed is. And you're going to hear me, by the way, say throughout today, this is what Hesed is. And you're going to think, well, I thought you said Hesed was this. And I just want you to know the answer is yes. It's probably both. Because this is a big, broad word that we're trying to define. So I want to look at some examples of human Hesed. First one, Abraham and Abimelech. In Genesis chapter 21, we see Pharaoh's winemaker to Joseph. Joseph asks him to show Hesed as he goes back to Pharaoh. Jacob's sons go and bury their father in Genesis 47. The spies to Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. Ruth and Naomi in Ruth chapter 1. We talked about Ruth during Christmas. And Ruth's commitment to Naomi was called by Boaz in act of Hesed. When she says, I will go where you go. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. She's committing herself to Naomi, and it gives nothing in return to her. There's really nothing in it for her, and it's not something that she has to do. It's something that she chooses to do because of who she is. And then finally, David to Jonathan and Mephibosheth. But I want to key in on just two of these stories for a moment to help you understand what human Hesed looks like and what Hesed really means. So the first one is I want to take a look at Jacob's sons burying their father. Here's the story. It says, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. When the time drew near that Israel, Jacob, must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if now I have found favor, if you remember, favor is from a few weeks ago. This is the word chen, which means gracious. If I have found graciousness or grace in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly, chesed, and truly, faithfully with me. And I As an aside, I want to say if we ever need to do a deal, a handshake is good enough for me, okay? Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And so the story tells us that Joseph takes his father from Egypt all the way back up to his homeland in Canaan at great cost to himself. It wasn't an easy journey. It certainly wasn't a short journey, but he takes him up there because he has Hesed and he wants to show Hesed to his father. Now notice, Jacob is dead at this point. It would have been very easy for Joseph to just say, let's just bury him here in Egypt. He won't know any better, right? He's not here. But he's bound by affection and covenant and commitment and loyalty and affection for his father. So he does what he says he would do, and he goes and he shows Hesed to his father even after he has passed. My favorite story, though, maybe is the one with David and Jonathan and Mephibosheth. If you know the story of David and Jonathan, it's an amazing story. I love it. Saul's pursuing David, and he's trying to hide from him, and Saul wants to kill him. The story, I won't read this whole slide to you, but basically, Saul wants to kill David. Jonathan, though, is Saul's son and David's best friend, and Jonathan is not convinced that Saul wants to kill David. And so he says, I need you to go find out if your father is going to kill me. And they make a deal here. There's the whole thing about how they lay in the field and shoot arrows, and they have these secret signs and these secret signals. But they make a deal together, and they make a covenant together. So go to the next slide. It says, may you treat me with faithful love. This is Jonathan requesting this of David. Will you treat me with Hesed as the Lord, with the same Hesed as the Lord, as long as I live? But if I die, treat my family with this faithful love, even when the Lord destroys all your enemies from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a solemn pact with David, saying, may the Lord destroy all your enemies. And Jonathan made David reaffirm his vow of friendship again. And Jonathan loved David as he had loved himself. These are two people who are best friends. They are close in affection, and they commit to each other that they will be loyal to each other and to their families, even after David takes over the throne from Jonathan's father, Saul. And so eventually that's what happens. Eventually what happens is Saul dies, Saul goes away, David takes the throne, Jonathan is dead, and here's where the story picks up. It says, and David said, is there anyone left of the house of Saul? He asked one of his servants that I may show him kindness, that I may show him Hesed for Jonathan's sake. Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. The king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the Hesed of God to him? Notice here, there's no one really left. There's no one looking for David to show Hesed, but because of who David is, he still wants to honor the commitment he has made to Jonathan. And so what Ziba, the servant, says, he says, there is somebody left. There's one guy, it's the son of Jonathan. His name is Mephibosheth, and he's crippled in both feet. He's lame in both feet. He can't walk. And so he's probably at this point very destitute. He's probably a beggar. He would have nothing left. And what David's job really would be to kill him, because he is a challenger to David's throne. A king who takes over for another king would not allow the old king's line to continue, because that would be dangerous for him. But instead of doing that, David decides to show Hesed to Mephibosheth. And so here's what it says. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth, and he answered, behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, do not fear, for I will show you kindness, Hesed, for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, what is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? That's a beautiful story and a really beautiful picture of what Hesed really is. That David goes out gaining nothing from this and brings in this cripple Mephibosheth, and he invites him to his table. And not only that, he also restores to him all the land of his grandfather Saul, which would have been an expansive, immense amount of land. And he says, simply because I want to show Hesed to the commitment that I have shown to your father, I invite you to my table, and you are always welcome here. And Mephibosheth looks at David and he says, why would you do that for someone who is a dead dog such as I, someone who is worthless like me? And I think in a lot of ways I can relate to Mephibosheth. And I think God in a lot of ways is like David, who he invites us to his table at great cost to himself, really gaining nothing except us. And he says, come and be a part of my table, because I love you and because I am a God of Hesed. Here's a definition to kind of wrap up what this section here. Hesed is what you call an act of loyal love. It's when someone treats another as a close friend or family member, doing what is necessary to ensure their well-being and the health of the relationship. While the action may be an obligation or a duty, Hesed also refers to the emotional motivation of love that drives overabundant expressions of generosity and care. That is exactly what God does for us. When he says he is a God of Hesed, what he's saying is he will do whatever is necessary to ensure the well-being of our relationship. He opens that door for us through Jesus' death on the cross, his ultimate act of Hesed for us. And he invites us in, even though we are like cripples and beggars at his table. We're like dead dogs, unworthy to be there. But because of what he has done, he invites us in. And that is the kind of God that we serve. That's the kind of God that he says he is. I want to look at a couple other examples to just explain to you a little bit more about what God's Hesed is like and show you some examples of when he shows Hesed to others. So here's a whole list. We got Abraham and Isaac. We have Jacob in Genesis chapter 32. Jacob, I want you to notice, he's very unworthy to receive Hesed from God. He cheats his father. He cheats his brother. He's cheated himself. He does all kinds of things that are wrong. His name means the heel grabber. He's a deceiver. It's not a great look for the Jacobs of the world, but he says in Genesis 32, he says, God, I'm not worthy of the Hesed that you have shown me. But even though he's not, God still shows it because God is still faithful. When God rescues the Israelites from Egypt, he takes them out of slavery and out of captivity. It's written in Exodus 15 that is an act of Hesed. We have the golden calf that I'm going to talk about in a minute, and Israel and the spies, and David and his family, and Israel in exile even. Over and over and over again, the Bible talks about how God is a God of Hesed. So I want to show you just a couple examples. The first one is I want to key in on the story of the golden calf. The story of the golden calf takes place when Moses is up on the mountain going to make the 10 Commandments with God. They're up there together. Not long after Moses leaves, the people, the Israelites, they start to get worried. They're like, well, what's going to happen up there? We don't know what's happening. We need something to worship. They're an idolatrous people, not much different than us. And so what they do is they take all their gold and they melt it down and they make a calf that they can worship. And God is up on the mountain with Moses, and he sees that, and he's angry. He's very angry because these people now, they're very undeserving because of what they've done of God's Hesed. It says, the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now, therefore, let me alone. He says, leave me alone that my wrath may burn hot against them and I may consume them in order that I may make a great nation of you. He's suggesting that he takes the blessing he gave to Abraham to make a great nation out of him and to bless all the nations of the world through Abraham. He says, let me remove that from Abraham and give it to you, Moses, and I'll make my blessing go on you. But Moses says, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven. And all this land that I promised, I will give you your offspring, they shall inherit it. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of, bringing on his people. And even in his anger, he still shows them Hesed. Even when they are entirely unworthy, he still shows them Hesed. Again, just later in the book of Numbers, we see a pretty similar story. In this story, what's happening is the Israelites are about to leave their desert wandering for 40 years, and they're about to take the promised land. And they send spies in to look at the promised land. The spies come back and they say, it's really dangerous. There's giants and there's people, and we're going to die. There's no way we can take this land. And what the people say, the Israelites, they say, we're going back to Egypt. We would rather be in Egypt under slavery because at least there we wouldn't die. So Moses and Aaron, we want to get rid of you. We're going to elect a new leader, and we're going to have somebody take us back to Egypt and put us back into slavery. We would prefer that to what God has done to us in the desert. And God looks at them thinking, he sustained them for 40 years. He's about to give them the promised land, and now they want to turn their back on him. And again, God is angry. It says, but in his anger, Moses talks to him again, and he reminds him what he said in Exodus 34. He says, and now please let the power of the Lord be great as you have promised, saying, the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, Hesed, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Please pardon the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, of your steadfast loving kindness, of your Hesed, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now. And what God does is he does. He does it. He forgives them. He shows them Hesed, even when they absolutely, positively do not deserve it. God is faithful in his Hesed. The last one I want to show you is with David. This is God speaking to David in 2 Samuel. He says this. He says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, when you die, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of man. But my steadfast love, my Hesed, will not depart from him. As I took it from Saul, who I put away before you, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. And if you know the story of Israel, you know that over and over and over again, they get sent into exile because they become idolatrous. But still, God's Hesed remains. Even when they are bearing the brunt of the consequences of their own sin, God's Hesed still remains. Here's another definition I want to give you to kind of wrap this section up. God's Hesed is expressed in a series of covenant commitments to restore the blessing to the nations through the family of Abraham, through Israel. He will do this by raising up an Israelite royal seed of David who will bring God's kingdom. Ultimately, that will be Jesus. His Hesed will not excuse each generation from maintaining loyalty in return. He will let any generation destroy itself, but he will maintain Hesed regardless. What I think is interesting there is that he even says this in 2 Samuel. He says, I'm not going to stop a generation from destroying itself, but even when that happens, my Hesed will remain. My Hesed will still be there. It's the same thing with us sometimes. Sometimes God is going to look at us in our sin and say, go ahead. You can do that. If you want to keep cheating on your wife and you want to bear the consequences of that, I'm going to let you. You want to keep cheating at work. You want to keep skimming off the books. You want to keep stealing or lying or deceiving or whatever it is that you're going to do. Sometimes God is going to let us do that. But the beautiful thing about the fact that God is a God of Hesed, who is abounding in Hesed, is that what it also says is when everything comes crumbling down around you, his Hesed will still remain. Because he is a God of Hesed, and it's not dependent at all on what you do. It's only dependent on who he is. And who he is a God of Hesed, and thank God for that. Amen? That is the God that we serve. And as we understand his Hesed, it should change some things in our life. We talk sometimes when we're talking about sermon creation about how do we apply this, and we talk about a vertical axis and a horizontal axis that represents God. How does this change between us and God? That's the vertical axis. How does this change our relationship with others? That's the horizontal axis. And today I want to talk a little bit about the center point of that, which is you, and how does this change you? I want to start here with God, though. How does this change the way that you look at God? Well, I want you to know that ultimately God's Hesed is shown through the cross. That he sent Jesus to die for us and really gets nothing out of it except relationship with you and I. But because he is a God of Hesed who wants to show generosity and loyalty and commitment and has affection and love towards us, he sends Jesus to the cross in the ultimate act of Hesed for us. That's a pretty beautiful picture. He loves and is committed to you. Michael Card wrote this book on the word Hesed. It's a whole book only just covering what that word means. And this is how he defines that word. He says, Hesed is when the person from whom I have a right to expect nothing gives me everything. When the person from whom I have a right to expect absolutely nothing gives me everything. And that's our relationship with God. We have no right to expect anything from him. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We have no right to expect it. But even still, he gives it. Even still, he gives us everything. And the beautiful thing is that it's not based on anything that I have done. Romans 5:8 tells us, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So it's not like we've earned it. He died for us when we were still sinners. But because he is a God of Hesed, it's who he is, he still offers us this gift of Jesus' death, giving us new life. That's Hesed. And ultimately, I think that it should also change how you see yourself. When we talk about ourselves, I want it to change how you see yourself. There's a couple of ways I think it should change you. The first is, if you're somebody who's proud and boastful and arrogant, the Hesed of God should humble you. For you to know that you've done nothing to earn or deserve it. It's not because of you. It's not because you're self-righteous. It's not because you've done all the right things. It's because of who God is. And it's only because of what he has done for you, because he has decided he wants to extend Hesed to you. That should change things and it should humble you. And on the flip side, if you're somebody who you've always felt inadequate, maybe you've never felt like you were worth staying for. Maybe you've felt worthless in your life before. You felt like you had no value. Hesed should change that in you. Maybe you felt like you were not worthy of commitment. You've been left behind maybe in a marriage, maybe in a job, maybe with various friendships. Maybe you've been discarded or left alone or invisible. Like you feel like the little sibling, or like you aren't good enough, like you're inadequate, like you aren't worth loving, like you never measure up, like nobody could ever love you like you need to be loved. Well, I want to tell you that God's Hesed says differently about you. It says you're not those things, but not because of anything you've ever done or not done, but because of who God is. That he is a God whose character is built around Hesed. That he is a God who is generous and loyal and loves you and has affection towards you. So when you feel worthless, you have to know it's not true. Those feelings simply aren't true because God says he's a God of Hesed, and he says you are worthy because he says so. Because through the cross, he makes you worthy. But lastly, I think this should also change how you see other people. It should change your relationship with others. If God's Hesed is what shows you that he loves you, that he feels those things towards you, I want to ask you, how do other people know that you love them? If it's God's Hesed that shows you that he loves you, do other people know that you show Hesed towards them as well? Are you willing to extend that same kind of love and generosity and affection to those in your life like God has shown it to you? And I have another question. If they don't see it through you, how will they ever know God's Hesed for them? If they don't see it through you, they're never going to understand that God is a God of Hesed. It starts with us. And it's our job to introduce and show that Hesed, that covenant, loyalty, love, generosity, and affection to everybody around us. Hesed should change everything for you. It should change your relationship with God. It should change your relationship with yourself. And ultimately, it should change your relationship with other people. That as we see that God is a God of Hesed, how can we be a people of Hesed as well? How can we show that to those around us? My prayer for you is pretty simple. I hope that this changes everything for you. Let's pray. God, we love you. And God, we are grateful and we are humbled and thankful that you are a God of Hesed. That you show us generosity and loyalty and affection when we are stiff-necked people. When we are people that have done nothing to deserve it. We thank you that you are a God whose character is made of Hesed. God, help us to embrace that this week, to let it change how we see you, to let it change how we see ourselves, and to let it change how we see other people. We love you, and again, we thank you for your Hesed for us. We pray this in your name. Amen.